Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started.
So this week we wanted to talk about a little bit of a current event and then brought it into a general topic. The current event is that the third-party YouTube client ProTube was removed from the App Store. Apple basically forced it out on Google's request because it was violating the YouTube terms of service, apparently. And I want to talk about some of that and then broaden that into the topic of generally developing apps that rely on other big services or that are not quite, that are kind of on the edge of what's considered okay or what might be allowed or what might be legal. The ProTube app specifically, it was a third-party YouTube app for iOS, and it had great reviews. I'm pretty sure Mac Stories did a big review on it once. That's where I heard of it first. And it had many YouTube Pro user features, many features that people want out of a YouTube app that the main app either didn't or wouldn't offer. You know, different playback, speeds, and originally it offered downloading for offline. YouTube forced them to remove that a long time ago. It offered things like stripping out the audio and just playing the audio and not having to rely on video so it could be played in the background. Things like that that the official app didn't offer for a long time, or if ever. Things like picture-in-picture support on the iPad that the official app made you buy YouTube Red to do. So you can kind of see why the official app and why YouTube might not have wanted this to happen. But there's quite a market to be had in doing things that people want that, like, the man won't let them do. ProTube existed in this market. This is something that I have a little bit of experience with. Ultimately, though, I try to stay away from this these days. A lot of developers try to build their business on a third-party API or app of some sort, whether it's YouTube or a social network like Twitter clients or other such things. And I get a lot of requests for me to open up an Overcast API so people could make third-party clients. There was a brief time in the internet where this seemed like an okay business model. I'd say around like 2004 or so, where all the web services were opening up public APIs that you could basically do whatever you wanted with, and access wasn't controlled at all. So anybody could write clients that did pretty much anything. And this was considered like a big part of Web 2.0 for a little while. And then everything started getting locked down, and what was public became private. What was free became controlled and locked out. And more recently, in more recent apps and services that have taken off, they either haven't had an API at all, or like in the case of Instagram, there is an API, but it's extraordinarily limited, or it might just be discontinued at any point, or you can't do what you really want to do, which is what most people would really want to do with such an API. There's a case to be made. There is lots of demand for apps that live in this gray area, that do things that a service might not want, or even if it has a public API that for the moment you're doing things that the API allows, there is a big market there, because usually, if you've heard of these services, they're pretty big. They have a lot of users, and everybody wants something to enhance their favorite service or to make it easier to use or whatever else. So it seems like there's a business there, or there's a market there rather. But trying to build an entire business in a situation like that, where there is this massive fundamental dependency that your app has on someone else's service, that I think is increasingly unwise over time. And that's not to say that nobody should ever do it, but it certainly should, I think, give you pause before you invest heavily into it. So, for instance, in the case of ProTube, I'm pretty sure that was somebody's full-time job. Or at least that was their primary app that they made, and I believe the author even said on the blog post that it did pretty well for a while, and it had lots of users. I personally, at this point in my life, I cannot imagine having my app be 100% dependent on someone else's service. Now, in the App Store, we are always 100% dependent on Apple. Like that is one dependency we always have, is that, well, Apple at any time could kick us out of the App Store. But in general, if you align your incentives with Apple's, or at least if you avoid stepping on their feet, there's not much reason for Apple to remove you from the App Store. Like, if you just have some regular app, why would Apple remove it? Like, that would be a huge PR risk to them, maybe even a legal risk if you're big enough. The fact is, Apple does not want to go around removing apps for no reason. So, like, I'm not worried with Overcast. I'm not worried that Apple is going to come along and all of a sudden say, you know what, podcast apps are now illegal again in the App Store, and therefore you have to leave. Like, that's, I don't stay awake at night thinking about that, because I think it's incredibly unlikely, because there's not much reason for Apple to ever do that. That would be too much downside for them compared to whatever little upside there might be. But if you're basing your entire app on something like Twitter or YouTube, or Facebook, some other big service like that, you are building a business in someone else's property. Like, they can do whatever they want, and they don't have the kind of neutral incentive collection that Apple has in that kind of scenario. Like, if you're building a Twitter app, you're competing with Twitter and their own app, using their own service and their own API to do it. So they are not going to be too keen on that. And even if one of these services has an API where they say that they're okay with something one day, the next day that could change. The next year that could change. They might have to boost their metrics, and your app might be taking away their metrics. They might get new leadership that wants to take the company in a different direction, or their investors might force the company to take a different direction. They might need to make changes to the product, and the API that your app relies on is getting in the way of that progress. There's all sorts of reasons why most companies and apps and services don't really need to let you build apps on them. And it usually is actually against their best interest these days to do that. And therefore, it is unwise to make your business rely on that. And so, in the case of ProTube and YouTube, it is really a shame that this great app that had a lot of big fans and had really been critically acclaimed, it's a shame that that app is now gone, because YouTube decided they had enough and they made Apple take it down. And by the way, I don't think Apple had any choice in the matter. Like, that's a simple legal request thing, and Apple does not need to put their neck out for that. That's not worth it for them. So this was really, if you want to be mad at somebody about this, be mad at YouTube, not Apple. But it's a shame this app is gone, but at the same time, it was never on solid ground. It was never guaranteed to exist forever. The author of it had no guaranteed right that it would exist forever, because it was always, from the beginning, built upon YouTube's property, using YouTube's service, doing things that YouTube really probably didn't want anybody to do, and living on the edge. And that really, really sucks for the developer that it's now gone and that business just disappeared. But on some level, that's just the risk you take when you live on the edge like that. Like, when you live on these gray areas, it could disappear at any moment. And so I'm not saying that you should necessarily never build an app like that, but you should expect that. You should go into it knowing that massive risk, knowing that at any time the ground could shift below you, and your entire app could just be gone, like in the snap of fingers. Like, it's just gone. And so, how much do you want to invest in that? How much do you want to rely on that? How much do you want to plan for the future of this business when that could happen at any moment?
Yeah, it's so tough too, because it's like, I feel at a personal level, I feel really bad for this developer. I think it's Jonas Gessner, I think is his name. Like, I have been in the position of making an app, having it be successful, and then having it sort of taken out of the store. Thankfully for me, that was many years ago when the App Store was a slightly different place. And so, like, eventually I was able to get it back in and so on. Like, that's a long story for another day. But, like, I have been in this exact position, and I know how this feels, and it feels awful. So at a personal level, like, it's very, very sympathetic to, like, how frustrating this must be. But it is, yeah, I think the thing that most fundamentally, when I think about these types of apps, like, there is anytime there's a popular service, like, there is a built-in audience And so building applications to cater to that audience makes sense, because it's like if you wanted to create your own video sharing, viewing platform that hosts all the content and has video creators publish your videos on your platform, etc. Like, that is completely insurmountable. So piggybacking on top of a big, popular, probably the most popular video service in the world, YouTube, makes a lot of sense. But inherent in that is like what you are in some ways doing is it's like you're making money off their service, off their costs. Like, YouTube is paying all the infrastructure costs. YouTube is paying all of the bandwidth costs for hosting this video, and then they don't have a mechanism to make money from that. YouTube makes most of its money from its advertising or its YouTube Red subscription service, both of which are things that, as any third-party client, isn't really showing to them. I mean, it's theoretically possible that YouTube could make a mechanism by which developers pay for the use of the API, but in general, I don't think that's the case. And so you're always in this kind of tricky position where you're making money off someone else's work in a certain way, in a very helpful, useful way, but it's a really tenuous thing, because that money that you are able to bring in, that business that exists, in many ways belongs to YouTube. They're creating the opportunity for doing that. They're choosing not to necessarily explore and exploit that themselves. They're not making the YouTube Pro app that would do all of these things, and they may have reasons for doing that. And they could be, who knows what that is. Like, maybe they don't want a lot of apps to exist that have background audio playback, because then they get in trouble with music labels, who then people are just using YouTube as a music streaming service, and that creates legal issues or problems for them, and so they don't want to go down that road. And sometimes they may want to let that exist. It reminds me in many ways a lot of sort of the early days of Twitter, where it existed. Part of what made it catch and fueled its initial growth, I think, was their openness of their third party clients, because it essentially gave them this massive free developer effort that they didn't have to directly pay for. They just paid for the infrastructure, but there was a lot of this creativity and innovation that happened around their platform that they didn't have to manage and direct. They could just sort of let 1,000 flowers bloom, and then ultimately they picked the most successful flower. They went after, they purchased Tweety, and made that the official client. And then now that that phase has happened, it's increasingly they are shutting that down. And I mean, there's a few players who make third-party Twitter apps now, but largely it's kind of this grandfathered in, not really supported or encouraged kind of thing. And in some ways that's great. If you happened to that's the best possible scenario, probably, that if you make this kind of dependent service where ultimately you're just kind of grandfathered in and you can just kind of exist, and you have this moat of protection around you because no one else can make these apps anymore. And so you're the only one. So that's awesome. But probably much more likely is what's happening here, where they just say, this is not something we want to do. And because you're sort of operating at our pleasure, like at any point we can just turn this off, they'll just turn it off. And while at some point maybe you can find crazy technical solutions to work around that, and things where you're not using this, it's not an official API, it's an unofficial API, or you're just you're posing as the official client. There's all kinds of crazy technical things, but ultimately, especially because we're existing in the App Store environment, where YouTube can just go to Apple and say, this developer is essentially, is violating our terms of service, is doing illicit things, we need you to take them down. You'll get taken down. It's not a world where that might exist. And so it's unfortunate that this happens. I feel really bad for the people involved in the actual situation, both the developers as well as the users. But yeah, it's always so tenuous, and it's something that I think we'll get into this a bit more later on too. But these types of opportunities, when they appear, they look so enticing because the audience of the platform is so big and the user base is so large that you look at something like when I think of these types of things, and I've thought about making YouTube related apps and content and features, it's like the universe of, it's like there's probably, I don't know, hundreds of millions, if not billions of people who use YouTube. And you start to play that game of like, well, what if I could only get like 0.1% of those people to download my app? Then that's huge. And it's like, well, if you did get to do that, if you did have an app that had a lot of success, in almost necessarily, the bigger you get, the more trouble you will have. And as a business, that sounds kind of fundamentally problematic. That most of us, when we were setting out to build something, we wanted to have the ability to grow steadily over time. Whereas in a situation like with almost all of these types of apps, the bigger your app gets, the more likely it is that the service that you're reliant on is going to become suspicious or, concerned about you. And maybe on the upside, eventually that would lead to something like an acquisition, which is like, I guess, the best version of this. Like if YouTube had come along and said, hey, we're going to buy, we're going to kind of acquire the ProTube app and, gain from the expertise and the experience of this developer, like that would be the happy ending. But, there's no guarantees of a happy ending in something like this.
Also, keep in mind, like, if even in that scenario where they acquihire you, think about the leverage that they have in that situation versus the leverage you have in that situation.
Yeah.
They can bring you into the room and say, look, you can come work for us for whatever amount of money we're going to offer you, which probably doesn't need to be that much because of what we're about to say, or we're going to shut you down. That's it. Like, we're going to cut off your API access, or you can come work for us. Like, you don't have a lot of leverage in that negotiation. They have all the power. So that even that is not a great outcome. So,
especially, too, if you're implementing features that aren't things that are technically difficult in the sense of like Twitter bought Tweety because Lauren Brichter is a genius and was doing things like he invented pull to refresh, and he was doing crazy iOS performance stuff in a way that at the time very few people could touch. And so like his leverage wasn't that he was doing things that he was doing things that Twitter just couldn't recreate. Whereas in this case, it becomes much trickier, and your position would definitely be much weaker. Where it's like it's things that the content provider or the platform owner is consciously choosing not to implement. Your leverage goes down dramatically.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons I think we see a lot of younger developers falling into the trap of assuming that they can build an app on this kind of thing and that they'll be okay, and that will be okay. And I think some of that just comes with experience of whether you trust that kind of stuff or not. But also, I feel like younger developers have. I'm sorry if this is insulting. I don't mean it to be. They don't often distinguish well between what's a public good on the internet and what's a private service, or you make assumptions about the private services that they are maybe more publicly available or more publicly open, or that you have more rights than you actually have. And like this is one of the reasons why all us olds talk about things like the open web and open protocols and open formats, decentralization. Because so much of the internet now is privatized. So much of usage, of metrics, of time spent is happening under the complete control of one of a handful of web giants, that there's almost nothing public left that a lot of people think about and use all the time and think about every day. Like, almost all usage is in Facebook, or Google does all the searches, and YouTube does all the video. And so if you actually want to try to build something lasting, build it on open platforms and open standards and in open places where you can be the business, you can be the service that's in control. This is one of the reasons I like podcasting so much, because Apple has some role in it, but not actually a very major one anymore. And so my main dependency on Apple is literally just the App Store. Like if the iTunes API shut down tomorrow, I'd be totally fine. So when you're choosing what to do, build in open spaces. Anyway, speaking of spaces, bad transition, but this episode is brought to you by Eero. Never think about Wi-Fi again. Eero has created the dream Wi-Fi setup, a fast, reliable connection throughout your house and all of its open spaces. And now is the best time to get on board with Eero. They've just released their new super slick second-generation devices. It is a tri-band model along with the new Eero Beacon. This allows you to build a Wi-Fi system that is perfectly tailored to your home. The second generation Eero also includes a third 5 gigahertz radio, making it twice as fast as before. So it's an amazing little thing. There's these nice little white devices. They are just beautiful. They're small, and they are incredibly easy to set up. So you just plug one into your internet connection, and then you plug in the beacons anywhere else in your house. And then they act as basically repeaters, but they communicate with themselves through this backhaul mesh network that is way faster than a traditional Wi-Fi repeater has ever been. The performance on these things is amazing, and you can even wire the remote ones if you want to get even faster performance. So it really is. It is by far the easiest multi-access point Wi-Fi setup. Heck, the easiest Wi-Fi setup period that I've ever seen. You download their app; it's all super easy. It walks you through it. And then this covers your house in Wi-Fi through multiple access points. It is wonderful. It's easy to manage. Highly recommended. And their customer support is amazing if you need any help. So the new Eero system starts at just $3.99 for 1 second-generation base station and 2 beacons. And that's everything most houses will need. If you want more beacons to expand your range, you can do that too, but most people won't need to. The 3 of them covers pretty much every house. So listeners of this show can get free overnight shipping to US or Canada when you head to Eero.com, that's EERO.com, and use the promo code RADAR. That's Eero.com, promo code RADAR for free overnight shipping. Thank you to Eero for their support of this show.
So, related to this type of this discussion of ProTube and relying on external services, I think an interesting place to wrap up might be to also talk a little bit about exploiting developer opportunities in this kind of seeing an opportunity, seeing a niche that exists, and then sort of trying to build an app inside of that. Because often I feel like that is especially as a smaller developer, one, 2, 3 person team, whatever, we are best able to thrive and flourish in these kind of small spaces that may be too small for a larger company to want to go after. Or maybe you have the ability to get in there right away. Like I've taken advantage of this many times myself, where a new API is introduced in iOS or watchOS, and I immediately jump on it and kind of dive in there to take advantage of it. And it's interesting because I feel like in some ways this is what this app was doing, but in others it's not. And I think maybe it's interesting to kind of differentiate between the types of opportunities that are likely going to be sustainable down the road, and these types of opportunities that are tenuous and exist sort of somewhat more transiently. It isn't necessarily that one you should only ever pursue the first and ignore the second, because there are certainly opportunities, I'm sure, where it's like making an app that is useful or exists, solely for a few weeks or a few months could potentially be worth doing. There's been numerous of these. I feel like that they come up in the App Store. Like when the iPods first came out, there's a couple of apps that were iPod finders before Apple introduced Find My iPod into the Find My Friends app.
AirPods.
The AirPods. And that those like Find My AirPods apps like exist in this kind of tenuous space that ultimately I think a lot of them were pulled from the App Store, so like maybe they didn't actually end up being financially viable in that sense, but like that kind of an opportunity where it's like, here's this thing that exists, it may have a very short-lived lifespan, but then like you can go in, you can take advantage of it, you potentially don't put in a massive amount of development resources into it, and then you move on. Like that's interesting, and that's potentially useful in a lot of cases. Versus, I think it's keeping in mind that there are other opportunities that are just these, building an app that is filling a space that is too small for someone it's too small for a big competitor to come in and try and compete with you with. and just, you know, surviving in there and taking advantage of that space. Like, I mean, I think of this, some of these, like, and for some reason, I think I'm on the Mac a lot more about these, but there's so many of these like little tools, these little utilities that exist to solve a little annoyance or fix something that's you know, doing window management. I mean, is a common example of something on the Mac maybe, where like you're solving this little problem that isn't, you know, that theoretically Apple could one day come along and Sherlock you. And usually that is the big risk for these kinds of apps, where, you know, you have some bigger person will eventually come along and slurp up that space. But you can often, you know, have a sustainable business for a long time. Or you can be in this kind of a situation where maybe other people aren't going after it, the opportunity, because it's kind of dubious or kind of tenuous as to whether it's something that's allowed. But I don't know. I think it's worth just considering, and probably the overall lesson is it's so easy as a developer, I think, to start down the road of development when you see an opportunity like that, to just go in and do it and worry about, like, you see this technical opportunity and you go and try and solve it. But it's probably the important thing is, or that I've learned from my experience, is to take like 2 or 3 steps back and be like, what is this likely going to look like down the road? You know, is this an app that I'm going to want to maintain? Is this an app that I think would make a sustainable business? What is the likelihood of this being Sherlocked down the road? I mean, and actually this very summer, like, I had a couple of ideas for apps related to iPad multitasking and some of the new changes there. And I think ultimately I've decided I'm not going to ultimately ship them, because the more I looked at it and the more I decided, like, I'm solving this very niche, narrow, like, problem that I think will exist for at most a year, probably less. You know, that I think there's these little rough edges that Apple will likely sand down over the next couple of point releases. And do I really want to go through the effort of building out a fully featured app and then putting it out and supporting it and maintaining it and having this expectational debt then that if Apple solves it but half solves it or makes it worse, then like it becomes this thing that I need to manage. And I just decided, you know, it's probably not worth it. And I think doing that exercise is something I didn't used to do. And so I just wanted to mention it as something to encourage everyone else to, whenever you see these little opportunities, make sure we're being thoughtful about if it's a good thing that is going to come back to benefit us in the future. And if it's not, go into it with eyes open, saying like, I'm making this app that I expect to sell for a few weeks or a few months, and that's okay. And if it was a big flash and a big fall, that's fine.
Oh yeah, I mean, I have failed to learn this lesson so many times. I mean, I made a magazine, then realized I didn't like running a magazine. I made an ad blocker, then realized it's a terrible business I didn't want to be in. I have made that mistake so many times of like being on the and especially like in the case of the ad blocker, and even to some degree Instapaper, when you are kind of like living on the edge of what might be considered legal with copyright or things like copyright, there's a huge market of people who want that kind of thing, and you can build a business there. But it's like building a business on the edge of a volcano. Like, it is a very, very high risk, and you never know like what could blow up in your face and really cause problems for you. I mean, people who made ad blockers were getting sued, like not that long after I stopped making mine, and I just narrowly dodged that risk. So again, it's like there's a business to be had here, but do you want that business? Are you willing to accept the risks of that? And how long is that going to be a business, and how much that is in your control?
Yeah, and I think too, it's the maturity of being okay with missing out is ultimately what I think it came down for. That like I had to grow as a person to the point that I could say, if I don't do this and someone else does, I need to be okay with the fact that they may have a good run or it could be successful, and not play the like, what if I had done it, if only I had done it kind of a game, because ultimately that's just going to drive you crazy. Like, you have to be like, make an informed decision, give it some thought, and then just be able to be like, you know, like that was the choice I made, and live with that, rather than just sort of making these choices out of just the fear of potentially missing out down the road. Like, that's no way to build a business, or to make choices in ways that are going to be, you know, sustainable for your mental health.
Thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll talk to you next week.
Bye.